Good morning and welcome to week two. And so I hope you enjoyed the first week as we kind of got into the water a little bit and splashed around and started to kind of understand the basis for intelligence collection analysis and ultimately how technology plays in there. This week we're going to start to dive in a little bit into collection management and redundancy, competitive analysis, and what that means in terms of redundancy. And then we're going to talk about some of the tests of knowledge that we can do on sources of information or even how we use our own brains, et cetera, in terms of analysis of collected material. So I want to start off this week talking about collection management a little bit and what redundancy is versus single source intelligence. So whether you're working in law enforcement or whether you work for the National Security Agency or the CIA, et cetera, the end state is generally to accumulate a pretty much an all source type product that's pulling in information from multiple sources that are providing information. So your collection is coming from multiple sources, and then you fuse together the information from those multiple sources to help you design those analytical conclusions. When we talk about the ints themselves, we would say, obviously, if I'm a SIGINTer, which is what I was, so full disclosure in terms of bias, right? But so as a SIGINTer, I might have a SIGINT event that I'm trying to corroborate. So maybe I reach out to see what I can get from HUMINT channels. Maybe I look at local media, et cetera, and I look and see what's out there in OSINT that might corroborate something that I've gotten from a protected classified source. And a HUMINTer might be the same way. Maybe they debrief a subject or a source and they have the HUMINT piece of it, and then they go out and say the HUMINT guy says there's something going on in a building. So now we go with redundant collection and we test maybe a GEOINT asset to go out and maybe shoot some imagery of a specific place to corroborate whether or not there's equipment there or something that maybe a HUMINT source said. So this is what happens when we say stacking assets, basically, and redundancy. We can also have redundancy within a single I'm sorry, I have a mosquito here. It's making me crazy. We can also have redundancy in terms of inside the same intelligence discipline as well. So a HUMINTer may have redundancy of collection sources from multiple human sources. A SIGINTer may have redundancy in signals collection because maybe he has something from ELINT and something from COMET, et cetera. So stacking means having more than one asset going after a collection, after a source. And then redundancy is using multiple ones either within the same discipline or across disciplines redundant against a single source. Okay, so I just want to be clear on that. The prospect of competitive analysis is another thing that you kind of see. I'm going to use the example of what we'll get into next week with like the Joint Terrorism Task Forces and the FBI and local law enforcement. But when we talk about competitive analysis and we're using collection management and we're stacking, we're using redundant collection and assessing those analytically, ideally we generally want to have more than one agency kind of looking at a target. This is called competitive analysis. Many years ago, the perception was that if you had, as an example, let's say the CIA collecting on something and the NSA collecting on something, there somewhere in between would be the ground truth, right? And the idea is that by having competitive analysis, you eliminate some of the bias that might come out of a single agency or a propensity or accidental overstepping of the bounds. Basically, everybody's kind of kept in check. So that competitive analysis of bringing in this, and this provides that decision maker, the policy maker, and even a law enforcement lead the best information in order to make a very founded decision, as opposed to gravitating towards one thing because they favor that, right? I brought up the JTTFs, which we'll talk about more next week, because you see this also cross-domain when we talk about the national level of intelligence agencies, and then we come down into law enforcement. There's like a gray area in there, and in the last 10 to 20 years since 9/11, we've started, and even before that, to be honest with you, but we start to push down into this thing so that we're building the stovepipes that used to sit up here. We're trying to flatten those out so there's more cross-communication, competitive analysis, but also coming vertically down those chains too, so that local law enforcement can work easier, say with the FBI. FBI could work easier, say with NSA, as an example, whereas before those charters used to be very, you are international and you are domestic, and neither the twain shall meet because of the Constitution and things like that. So we're seeing those kinds of changes too. Interestingly enough, competitive analysis also can play into funding. And so there's sometimes a bad part of competitive analysis where when you have multiple collection assets and agencies collecting on the same target, there's a weird part of the competition that bleeds into the analysis of the person who wants to break the story first. So think about like multiple newspapers, say, the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. They have a similar source. They're going after the same story. Each one wants to break the story first, right? And let's flip that out and say one is NPR and one's like radio. So now we have a radio guy and we have a print guy going after the same source, and they want to break the story first. Why? Because it's going to get them more subscribers. It's going to get more attention. It brings advertising dollars, X, Y, or Z. So not waving like my big cynical flag in the United States government, but there is a piece of that at the national level too. Of each agency, each analyst, each collector, there's an inherent ego in there, and you want to be the winner. You want to be the person that gets that information first. This kind of goes back to those weird biases too. And we want to make sure that we check those types of attitudes and we're doing the job for the right reasons, right? And not because of ego. And from a competitive analysis perspective, that you do the best you can and you try to work within those enclaves. But sometimes, if you look at the history of the CIA, you'll see that the history of the CIA goes like this, like they're really good and then they do something wrong when they get in trouble. They're really good and then they do something wrong, get in trouble, blah, 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 blah. Each time they did something good, it's because they were resourced really, really heavily because they were doing really good things. And then the resourcing goes down because they did something wrong and their attention shifts to like the FBI or NSA, XY, whatever, GOINT, DIA. And then CIA starts to do some good things again. And I'm not picking on the CIA because you could say the same thing for NSA. The competitive analysis, the funding becomes very, very important too, because as technology increasingly comes into the IC, into the intelligence community, that funding becomes paramount in terms of escalation of technologies that provide solid collection against current technology that the globe is using. Recruiting of top-notch people to be able to do those jobs, and significantly not just the research and development, but the integration of those types of technologies into the system. So this whole idea of redundancy and competitive analysis, there's a political piece of that over here too, which I did just want to throw that out there so people will understand that as well. But the idea, coming full circle back to the initial blush, is that if you have the assets available and you have the resources available, you're only going to up the caliber of what it is you're looking at from an analysis perspective if you have redundant, stacking and coverage of an event or a person or whatever the target happens to be, okay? So then the second thing that we're going to talk about this week is the 4 tests of knowledge. So when you look at George and, I'm sorry, I forgot his other name, Bruce. I'm so sorry. So if you look at George and Bruce, when you're reading this week, you're going to see that they have these 4 tests of knowledge, and then they address a 5th one, which kind of combines some of the other ones. So I asked you this week in your discussion to pick like an OSINT event, and this is kind of a precursor to what you're going to be doing next week in Module 3 when you start to do your first briefing. But pick something that you see in the news or whatever, and then review these tests of knowledge that George and Bruce have outlined in their book as part of your reading, and then kind of discuss how you might apply those 4 tests of knowledge to this event that you're reading. So the 4 tests of knowledge from George and Bruce are authority, habit of thought, rationalization, and empiricism. So without saying much, obviously, because we're using OSINT, because we don't have classified sources where we can go out and stack or be redundant and use SIGINT, GOINT, X, Y, or Z, although you do have Google Earth, I suppose. The one that's going to play in most to what it is that you're doing is authority. So the test of knowledge is authority, because the authority that you're going to be using obviously is the media. And so when we look at a test of knowledge related to authority, it's important to understand that it relies completely on what the source of the information is. And that can be anything from the media to a national level organization to a human being. The WMD thing in Iraq a gazillion years ago, some of you may remember that and some of you probably don't. But there was a big point of that when Colin Powell, who was the Secretary of State at the time, stood up basically and validated, oh yes, there's WMD, there's weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And so by the authority of who Colin Powell was himself, as a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and, one of the senior ranking Army guy within the Department of Defense, and then he became the Secretary of State, that level of authority of what came out of his mouth lended validity to that analytical conclusion, which turned out to be incorrect, right? Along with several other things. So the second one is habit of thought. So when you're looking at that OSINT, look at it and say, is this article going a certain direction just out of habit of thought? And habit of thought is basically what we would say is prejudice in individuals, and it goes back to some of the biases that we talked about in week 1, and we're going to continue to talk about those because they can impact collection management and how we target and collect. It can also impact analysis, and then obviously on the receiving end, it can also impact how we receive that analysis and make decisions. And so, and then it also applies to conventional wisdom in groups where, there's a groupthink basically, which is, where people are afraid to challenge the consensus of the group, even if they're like, I'm not sure that's right. People just kind of go along with it. And so we have groupthink. And we would see, there's a couple examples of that, and George and Bruce mentioned, I think, the Japanese, the U.S. perception of Japan prior to World War II of, oh, they can't fly and they can't do X, Y, or Z, and look what happened. From a more contemporary example, I would say that when we look at asymmetric warfare, and we can look at Osama bin Laden, but we'll just say asymmetric warfare, during the Cold War, the United States became so steeped into force-on-force type warfare, conventional warfare between two nation states, that our doctrine was absolutely staged around that type of thinking, that we kind of like, oh, asymmetric warfare, that's kind of over here militarily, special forces guys do that, the CIA dabbles in it, it is what it is. So when indicators started to be collected through events and just, through SIGINT and things like that, related to the rise of Osama bin Laden and what would ultimately become Al-Qaeda and what would then subsequently become ISIS, the aspect of conventional wisdom within the groups was, well, that's not a threat to the United States in the United States. It's not a large national security threat. It's a threat in like foreign travel or for our military personnel abroad. It's that type of threat, it's not like, oh my God, what if Russia gets nukes or North Korea gets nukes, etc. Okay, so this habit of thought is a big test of knowledge that needs to, and hopefully we've learned our lesson from that. And now we kind of see it flipping back the other way, right? Now we're looking more conventionally as we look at Iran and we look at North Korea. And what was just in the news, consistently is that don't forget that ISIS is still out there, right? So somewhere in there is the ground truth. So habit of thought as a test of knowledge. Am I looking at this and am I perceiving this as a habit of thought, right? Who's the authority? What is my habit of thought when I'm receiving this? Rationalism basically is your reason, how you look at things. There's 3 different types of rationalism. You'll learn about them when you go through the book. I'm sorry, I keep kicking the table as well. So we have deductive, inductive, and abductive reasoning. This is probably one of the more complex pieces of your reading this week, but just kind of pay attention to it. It makes sense. Reason is drawing a conclusion. He uses Socrates as an example, that all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, so therefore Socrates is immortal, right? As a mortal, not immortal. Inductive basically is looking at the strengths and weaknesses, and then abductive is basically, I think they say Sherlock Holmesian, where you're picking the best hypothesis that fits what you have in terms of the information. Okay, and then the last one that we have is empiricism, which is basically related to your senses, and it's empirical data, right? It's what I can see, what I can smell, what I can taste, what I can hear, what I can touch, etc. And George and Bruce, when they go into this, they're going to talk to you a little bit about how this applies basically to the ints, because all of those ints rely on those senses. SIGINT is what I hear, and then what I'm reading from a transcript, right? TOINT is what I'm seeing. Human is what I'm hearing and saying, etc. So MASINT, although I'm not tasting it with my tongue, MASINT would be that sense, though, of picking up particles in the air, or sifting through a nuclear footprint or a radioactive footprint. Telemetry of missiles, vibrations in the ground, etc. So I always call MASINT the big sexy, because it's very Star Trek-y, from a, if Bones had his tricorder, whatever. If you know Star Trek, thanks for coming along with me on that one. But it's a very different int. So these are some of the things that we're going to talk about this week. So make sure you stay in the reading, keep doing the reading. But this is my once over the world on some of the things that you're looking at this week. And it's okay to express opinions in your posts. Again, be professional, respond professionally. Please stick to the standards of APA. Look at those examples. I am a grammar Nazi and I am an APA Nazi. I shouldn't use the word Nazi. I beg your pardon. Whatever. I'm sorry. So I do focus on grammar, and I do focus on those things, because if you want to work in intelligence or law enforcement, your ability to lay that stuff down in a very coherent and professional fashion in terms of usage of the written language, usage of graphics, etc., it becomes very, very important. And as for APA, you may not use that if you go work at the Central Intelligence Agency, but you will follow whatever process they have, and they will expect you to abide by that process. So that's one of the reasons that we hit that so heavily in this program, okay? So that's it in a nutshell. I look forward to seeing what you have this week for your posts. And we're moving right along. And then next week we go into our briefing. So we're just kind of staging and prepping you for that, right? And I hope you enjoy this week's assignment. And I'll see you in discussion. Take care. Bye.